Okay, wonderful. Hello, everyone. My name is LaShawn Benedict, and I'm the community manager for iCord's Community of Practice. For those of you who may be hearing about iCords for the first time, iCord stands for Improving Community Health Outcomes through Research, Dialogue, and System Strengthening. And it is a community of practice and really a platform for communication, collaboration, and knowledge exchange within the social and behavioral science research disciplines to ultimately address implementation gaps and current issues facing neglected tropical disease programs. We would like to welcome you to our very first Knowledge Exchange Café session that is titled Imagining a World Free of Trachoma, a conversation about applied approaches to designing and implementing sustainable behavior change interventions, which will be presented collaboratively by Sightsavers and ThinkPlace. The Knowledge Exchange Café is one of our monthly initiatives here at iCords, which will bring together individuals to network and learn from one another's research and experiences. The emphasis in these discussions will be on the social and behavioral sciences as it relates to neglected tropical diseases, and how they can help us reach the WHO 2030 NTD Roadmap goals. The Knowledge Exchange Cafes are also an opportunity for you to utilize the iCords platform to share new and interesting work. And this could take on a variety of formats, whether it's presentations, feedback sessions, showcasing a video, utilizing breakout rooms, as well as networking. So please, please, please contact me if you would like your work to be featured during our next session. And remember, to register as an iCords member so you could benefit fully from all the service offerings we have. And you could do so by visiting www.icords.org. And if you're interested in hosting a session for a Knowledge Cafe in the future, please reach out to me at lbenedict@briere.org, and I'll include the links to both in the chat right now. So moving forward, I'm going to hand it over to Jordy Woods, who will take us away.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Good night for some of us. So I really appreciate everyone that has taken time to join the first Knowledge Cafes. It's an honor and a privilege to present on behalf of Sightsavers, my organization, and alongside ThinkPlace. Yeah, so kind of building on that, we collaboratively have been working on a program called the Accelerate program, which is a program that it's aimed at the elimination of trachoma, and hence the name, accelerating the progress towards the elimination of trachoma. Next slide. Accelerate, it's a program that's operating currently in 14 countries across sub-Saharan Africa. And it's supported by a collective of philanthropists, and really its aim is to support the full safe strategy, which is surgery, antibiotics, facial cleanliness, and environmental improvements. And we'll be talking about the last part of that today, really, and focusing in on the behavioral science aspects and behavior change elements of really promoting the hygiene and wash elements of strategy. So just, the slide here is just sort of showing where the Accelerate program is operating. It's not just social behavioral science and interventions, but it's across all of these countries. And you'll see those numbers there. We really have ambitions to eliminate trachoma in all 14 of these countries by those dates. So we're, I think, really excited to have developed a set of interventions that will hopefully last long beyond the elimination of trachoma in those countries. Next slide. But what I'm going to sort of just pass over to my colleagues here in a minute to walk us through what we really have seen as sort of, I think, an interesting approach to the development of behavior change initiatives. One of the things that happens in behavior change and in public health is that these interventions take a really long time to develop, and then by the time you develop them, you only got this small period of time to implement. I think that a lot of maybe folks on this call and colleagues relate to that. So, why does it take so long to develop these interventions? There's a lot of science involved. You go out in the field and you do all this research. So really what we want to talk about today is using the platform design to speed up that process and speed up the feasibility of implementing behavioral science interventions. There's a lot of interventions that are theory-based, but we really want to be able to use and leverage different platforms to design better interventions and adapt them as they go. So the slide you see here is a little bit what we're talking about. Currently, we have up and running what our colleagues ThinkPlace will kind of walk us through today in these 7 countries, and that a lot of that is based on the development and ideas that was developed with ThinkPlace and all of the ministries of health and partners and communities that were part of this process. So without further ado, I will hand over to my colleagues from ThinkPlace. Today we have Elliot Duffy, who is Executive Design Manager for ThinkPlace, based in Australia. And then he'll be followed by Vedan Mwasi and Samira Metan. I've practiced her name several times, so I think I've gotten it right this time. And they're both based in Senegal. Vedan is an executive designer, a strategic designer for ThinkPlace, and Samira is the studio lead there in Senegal. So over to you, Elliot, and thank you everybody for joining.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Jordy and Lashan and iCords for the opportunity. Yeah, look, so to kick this conversation off, as far as our work goes, we wanted to start talking a little bit about why this sort of rapid approach, and then how did we approach building in behavioral science into the work we were doing. And I want to come right out front and say, we're not behavioral scientists by training. We're actually started in the world of design and human-centered design. But a lot of that is about, when you're designing something, it's about understanding all aspects of the experience that a target audience is going to interact with what you're creating. So behavioral science was a natural addition into that practice, and we've started to layer it in here. Jordy mentioned that we used a very rapid approach, and to give you an idea of how rapid that was, we were really only running about a month worth of hands-on work, so 2 weeks in really tight targeted research, and then 2 weeks in intervention design, and of course time on either side to plan and then to formulate and prepare for handing over to and presentation to the relevant governments. But really a month worth of dedicated work to go from, as far as we were concerned, as the design team, to go from 0 to intervention design. So very, very rapid. Next slide, thanks. So what I'm going to talk through here is not intended to say that this is the way that all behavioral science projects should go. We know that there's a really big need for that sort of deep scientific approach, but what we want to show is that there's another way that it can be integrated more broadly and throughout probably most projects that are focusing on behavior, without attracting the price tag that can be a problem for funders. There's a bit of a key for when you should apply this, and we looked at this problem under the Accelerate program against these 4 lenses. So firstly, you've got to think about, is the space we're trying to address, is it a known space? So is it a completely new behavioral phenomena we're trying to address? If not, of course, you're probably going to need to do some preliminary work. But in the case of trachoma, there's been a lot of work towards elimination already. So we know things that work, but we know there are areas that it needs adaptation or provocation to really accelerate that. The second point there, if there are adjacent problem spaces that are solved, so whether it's in the case of NTDs, it may be a similar NTD, like like schisto, for example, where we know there are some interventions there, or it could be the same problem space, but in a different context. You know, maybe we've solved it in urban environments, but there are rural areas. And in this case, there was a lot of progress that had been made in the majority of the populations, but there were these sort of particular populations, urban poor, nomadic areas, where it was a little more intractable. So adjacent problems, there are lessons to learn that we can then try and build from. Number 3, we can anticipate some of the problems. That's going to apply to pretty much any sort of WASH-related intervention. There's a lot of thinking on WASH. So before we even go to the field, we can probably guess that there's going to be some issues. Is it an access to water issue? Is it a prioritization issue? We can start to develop hypotheses before we do preliminary research. And then the 4th there, when the problem space has aspects that are shared or universal. And the reason that one's important is because we're doing such tight turnarounds, it allows us to take lessons from, if we're doing a month in Kenya, that then allows us to build on that as we go to Ethiopia or to Nigeria or to wherever the next place is. So we can build on it iteratively and go back and amend as we go. So rapid design, not for everything, but in my experience, so many spaces in public health that are now looking at behavior change probably fit in this category, in this rapid design approach. Next slide. So I want to walk through some of the things that we looked at from a behavioral perspective, and I want to frame this around one of the key behaviors for trachoma elimination, and that's open defecation. So we're probably all aware that there's huge amounts of effort going into this, and yet we still see adoption in some areas that are quite slow. So plenty of learnings that we could take into the field before we did any of our research. From a behavioral lens, and I'll jump to the next slide. When we look at when we're looking at the behavior, we were really looking at what's driving individual decision making, and then how's the social element influencing that? Are there certain norms at play? What's the community attitudes? Those sorts of things. We also look at environmental as well, which I won't jump into here, but environmentals then looking at some not purely, but often physical barriers. Is the behavior able to be executed? Next slide. So when we're looking at individual, I just want to zoom in on 2 of the things that we really focused on when looking at the problem of latrine usage and open defecation, sensory experience and fears and anxieties. Often when we do these sorts of behavioral studies, we might do a CAP study, knowledge, attitudes, perceptions, and CAP B and behaviors. That's fine, there's some real value there, but this starts to get specific into certain areas of it. So on the first one, on the next slide, when we go into the sensory experience, it was a pretty easy observation. So day 1, I'm sure many of you would have experienced some of these delightful sensory experiences. People were making a choice. Do they take the left-hand experience or the right-hand experience? So often we're trying to ask someone to do a behavior, but there's just some really simple experiences that none of us would prefer over the other that you can pick up really, really quickly. And it's quite interesting if you go into a fancy building or a fancy home. The bathroom is often the area where there might be a candle on the windowsill. It's often the cleanest room in the house, paradoxically. So we see this in other areas where that's really prioritized. So the question came to us, well, well, if that's the sensory experience, why aren't we prioritizing that? Jump into the next slide. And then when it came to fears and anxieties and the sort of attitude towards latrines, these are the sorts of stories that you come across. So whether they're true or not, these stories were sort of pervasive in a lot of the communities. Safety concerns, people drowning or falling in, safety risks of using latrines and particular community latrines at night, and fear of gender-based violence. And then just the positioning of them in their environment. There was a one bit of research where we asked some kids at a school, why don't you use the pit latrines? And they just simply said, well, we know that's where the snakes are. So of course, they're not going to go there. So this is often, these are real risks, but it kind of doesn't matter. And often they're perceived risks. And even when you can solve the infrastructural or environmental risks to these things, those community stories and perceptions can continue. So those are two of the things that we might consider. Next slide. Those observations, and those are observations that we can make in a day, really. They prompt what we'd call a design question. So how might we improve the sensory experience, or how might we reduce the enjoyment or the sensory experience of the undesired behavior? And how could we redesign visual or physical cues to provide a sense of safety? Next slide. Looking into social, again, lots and lots and lots that we could go into in social norms, but these two that I wanted to focus on, very much so a focus of this project, but also tends to be the top two things that we might look at in most behavioral challenges. The first one is looking at what is a source of pride or shame in that community. And then the second one is really around in-group and out-group dynamics. So these are what are the stories told about ourselves, and what are the stories that we tell about others? If we jump into the first one on the next slide, pride and shame is, I suppose, the non-scientific way to really look at a couple of core drivers. So on the left-hand side is how we would frame up pride in a social setting. So how does a community member gain acceptance and position within the group? Now, in a problem space like open defecation, when we look at this, we don't necessarily look at it just as it relates to open defecation. We might look at it as what generally is a good community member, or what generally is thought of as a shameful behavior within the community. And that gives us some signals about what motivates, and therefore what can we use to leverage new behaviors. So with pride, you're really looking at how someone weighs up the size of a risk of a pride-giving behavior, and whether that success will be attributed to them. So if I do this, am I likely to be successful? And if I am successful, will the community recognize me for that? And that's the social gain there. Will the group, recognize that, and will I attain, a couple of social status points if I'm successful? And then on the shame side, how does the community prevent things they don't want in that area? So often there might be, certain things that the community is just expected to maintain. When it comes to wash, it might water and sanitation, it might be there's a community social pressure around certain levels of cleanliness of the house or of the yard around the house. And they're weighing up things like, how likely am I to get caught? If I'm not caught, how great is the benefit? And if I do get caught, what will be the social ramifications of that amongst the group? So in in a behavior like this, it's a somewhat private behavior. So it can be tricky because that level of shame that might be associated might be hidden away. But also, pit latrines are often in the middle of communities if they're not household latrines. So it's quite public. So there can be a high level of shame associated there. So those are two key pieces that we look at that. And on the next slide, you'll see some quotes about how that played out in the research. So we heard things like, if you own a latrine, it shows you have money, and that's something to aspire to. So straight away, we could see latrine ownership in this particular community was how the community was signaling wealth. It was a signal of pride. Now, I'll be specific there. We're talking about household latrines, not community latrines. And on the next slide, we also heard a couple of quotes in tension of that. When you go to that room, everyone knows what you're going to do. You're going there for a poo. So there was also this, but I don't want anyone to know I'm using it. Or I won't use the latrine because I don't want to be disrespectful to the elders and women in the community. So there are these competing forces of pride and shame in that particular community. Jump to the next slide. The second area I mentioned was in-group and out-group dynamics. That picture on the right there is something from a current piece of work I'm looking at around social behaviour change for drug use in Australia. And now this is I think it's a current campaign, but this is a prime example of bad out-group messaging. So an out-group message is when someone's using the voice of a group that I don't relate to tell me a message. And we use this a lot in public health. So it might be a message from the government, it might be a message from one of our organizations, and it sounds like one of our organizations, or it sounds like the government. And because of that, depending on the attitudes of that group towards that organization, you have a high risk that that message will be rejected immediately. In this case, with that picture, I'm not sure recreational drug users in Australia hold the police in high regard. So they're very much so considered an out group, and that message will just be completely ignored. So we know in social psychology that these sorts of social groupings are critical to how we need to frame our messaging. And we tried in this project to really make sure we were looking at how can we use peer-to-peer messaging to use in-group messaging rather than positioning typical work from a public health organization or saying, hi, we're ThinkPlace and we think you should do different. We'll jump to the next slide. So this is some examples of how out-group and in-group was playing out. So we had comments like, only people with money have latrines. People like me don't need to use them. So we had a section of the population we were targeting that were actually saying, no, the group over there uses latrines, but I'm not part of them. So when you say we should all use them, I don't think you mean me. I think you mean someone else. On the flip side, we had groups saying, we have a latrine because I come from a modern family. So this idea of modernity was how they were forming up their in-group for owning a latrine. So that modernity became something we learned as both a pride signal, but also as a signal for people were, some areas of the community were less likely to want to share or want to see that growth because it changed the in-group, out-group dynamics, and they didn't want to do that. Next slide. So we can turn those into these sorts of behavioral design questions. How can we give people socially acceptable reasons to visit the latrine? How can we use in-group language or channels to connect with our audience? So on that first one, we often do it ourselves rather than saying, I'm going to go do a poo, we say, I might just go to the bathroom, or I'm just going to go freshen up. So we have socially acceptable language that we already use to give ourselves that permission. Next slide. So an example of what that looks like, and my colleague Bidam will go into this example in a little more detail, but when we go into the field, we're looking for signals of what might indicate pride or shame, or what might indicate a lever we could pull. This is an actual example from an area in southern Ethiopia. We started to see some patterns where the lady on the left there was actually part of our mobilization team in an area, but she was from that area. She was a health extension worker, and she kept wanting her picture taken. So that's okay, that's fine. And then as we went to more houses, we noticed these sort of small magazine cutouts were everywhere, and they were always women wearing nice clothes, or with makeup done up, or with their hair done. So there started to be this pattern around photos and representation of beauty. So on the next slide, we turned that into an intervention like this. How could we associate beauty, which was a signal of pride, with clean family who wash regularly, which was the target behavior? So it takes a bit of a creative link to link those together. But on the left-hand side, you can see that what the intervention was. It was family photos of clean, recently washed faces, and then put next to a mirror. And the mirror was about triggering a daily habit. It's what we call a salience trigger. Bidam will go into more detail, so I'll leave that one there. But if we jump quickly into, I suppose, some of the more theoretical bits that are underneath what we do, on the next slide, there's a whole list of different behavioral models that we use, and we use them as sort of filtering tools just to check which ones we should apply. But this is one we use for most areas, and it's the first stage we need to do, which is what type of intervention do we need? If the target group understands the behavior we're asking them to perform, do they know what face and hand washing is? Then it's an education response. In my experience, probably most interventions in public health focus on education, but it's one piece of the pie. So if they know it, but they're not doing it, then we start to look at a motivation intervention. So do they value the behavior enough to perform it? And the last one is, do they know it? Do they value it? And maybe they do it every now and then, but it's not at the regularity we need. And that's what we would call an enablement intervention. And enablement is really around habit building and getting that repeat behavior. Oh, next slide. I'll jump really quickly through a couple of the models we might flick through. This one's called, well, it's creatively called in-peer awareness, but it's about how do you understand in-peer dynamics of the uptake of an idea. So that central green belt there, we'll look for where do we need to target for the particular social group. In-peer awareness is about, is the group talking about it? Comprehension and value is about, do they value it? Trialability is about, can they have a go without committing, whether it's financial or emotional or socially? Can they try it? And then confirmation is, if they tried it, did it give them the value that they expected it would? And those sort of loops that go around it are, what we know is at any point of that value, of that process for adoption, they have peer messaging that might influence the way they feel about it. So we can target quite specifically with an intervention what stage of that it is, and then feed messaging to the peer groups that might positively affect it. Next slide. I won't go into detail too much on this one, but this is another one we use at really a society level. It's comes from diffusion of innovations theory from Everett Rogers. Diffusion of innovation is basically a theory that explains how new innovations spread through a society and how long that can take. Depends on those 4 factors on the side there. But the main thing about this is we know that for diffusion of a new idea to happen, and that new idea could be a thing like a phone or a latrine, or it could be a behavior. There has to be a minimum level of adoption amongst a population. And once you get that minimum level of adoption, you kind of don't have to do anything else. The sort of peer norms can then take it away into more organic diffusion. So we can use this to target who are those minimum people that we need to actively influence, and then leave the rest. Next slide. And the last model I'll look at is really around individuals. And some of you have probably seen this. It's the habit loop by Charles Duhigg. This one's actually an updated version from James Clear. But the habit loop is really mapping this interplay between what happens neurologically in our brains and how does that combine with what happens externally, or what are the triggers that are causing me to do a behavior. So it goes through cue, craving, response, reward, and that cycles into repeat behavior. So the easiest example is usually smoking. And if you're a social smoker, it might look like that first table on the left. So when I drink alcohol, my body releases a chemical trigger that makes me crave nicotine. Therefore, I smoke a cigarette and I get a hit of dopamine as that nicotine is released. So there's an internal biochemical thing happening and then an external action. We'll jump to the final slide, I think, from me. No, we won't. That'll be the final slide. I'll hand over to Bidan, I think, next, who'll take you through some of the more detail of our interventions that we worked through.
Thank you, Samira. My internet is a bit shifty, so I'll use Samira's computer. We are in the same room, actually. So thank you for that, Elliot. I think that sort of gives us, helps the group understand what we were working with. We'll give a few examples from the field, and these are examples of the countries that we went to, focusing on what was the context of those countries, what exactly did we do in those countries, and what are some of the lessons that we learned from them. So if you go to the next slide, this was yours, Elliot? Yes, exactly. So the first country that we went to was Ethiopia. And Ethiopia, we did an intervention called My Clean, Beautiful Family. So to sort of give you the context of Ethiopia, we had teams.
Oh, look like we might have lost Bidan and Samira there on their Wi-Fi. But I can jump in on that while they hopefully get their connection back. But this intervention was focused in southern Ethiopia, and it's the intervention I mentioned earlier, and it was really about how do we trigger household level hand and face washing more regularly. And basically, the way the intervention worked is we would turn up. Well, in our case, we were prototyping, so it was us. But oh, there we go. You got your back bit done?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Yeah.
Yes, so we currently don't have electricity in the office, so we are selling, and that's not the most reliable. So, as I was saying, let me know when I drop off if I don't see it myself. So, as I was saying, SNNPR as a region has different ethnic groups, and one of the challenges was if we were moving from, let's say, one region to another that's not even that's even like, let's say, 5 kilometers. 5 kilometers within a 5-kilometer radius, we'd have to sort of find another translator because they speak another language, and you'll be finding a completely different type of people. Something else that we realized was in this region, family was a big theme, and that was also one of the highlights that enabled us to sort of use this intervention. It was slightly remote. It was a 5-hour drive from the capital, so that was slightly remote. And something that we did was we had to carry our own printer so that we could print the photos that we took at the hotel. So what exactly we did in this specific region, we would visit families and have and one thing that we realized was water was readily available because each family had a well at the backyard, if I could frame it like that. So water was not an issue for these households, and it was possible to ask them to use water. What we did was take photos of them. So we'd have a conversation and explain the intervention itself. Then we would ask them to clean their hands and faces and take a photo of them in their clean face. And we would explain that we would come back and bring these photos as a gift, as our gift to them. Some of the households or some of the participants were a bit were concerned. They were like, we have all these NGOs who come to our region and they say this and say this, but they never come back. The moment they get what they are looking for, they go and don't come back. So that meant when we came back now with the photos and the mirrors attached to them, they were really, really excited. Like you could see the excitement in their faces. And also you could see the excitement in their faces as we took the photos themselves. The idea behind it was attaching their faces to a mirror and now asking them to place that mirror at in their household at a place where they normally, they will always see it. So in this case, it was in the living room. And anytime they would go to look at their face, they would see their clean face as a behavioral nudge that you need to clean your face. This intervention itself worked really well, but there were instances where you'd find a house saw this gift as such an important gift, and they would go store it in the bedroom. So they would go and be like, this is such a nice gift, so I don't want to put it in the house itself. So maybe if you were to think through this again, it would be with a clearer place of where do we want the families themselves to put it. I will go to the next intervention, which is from Nigeria. And Nigeria was was more interesting because we started the research itself before COVID. And this intervention was done during COVID. So we had to innovate around how do we actually do this remotely. The context of Nigeria was we went to the northern side, to the northern region of Nigeria, that's Sokoto and Jigawa, that's predominantly Muslim. And the main population is Hausa Fulani. The communities themselves. So one thing that we realized in these households was marriage was a big theme, especially amongst young people, and that became a nudge for us. Something that I would point out was young people who would leave the villages and go work in big towns, let's say like Abuja or Lagos, would come back to the village itself, and they would be the first to sort of bring innovation or bring exposure from the city to the village. So one of the characteristics we realized was that anybody who had a bit of exposure would build a latrine in their household when they came back. And now young people would sort of build households when they were transitioning into marriage. So you'd have someone living at their parents' house, then the moment they do a wedding, now they transition into their own sort of household. That was an important point to sort of encourage them to build latrines, because that's where now they were thinking of building a house, and how we did that was using a radio campaign. So the radio campaign itself was called Upgrade Your Life. And it looked at, and it had like 4 segments that were aired in both Sokoto and Jigawa. And the first segment was more of awareness. How do we let the people know about trachoma? How do we educate them about this is how you can sort of eliminate trachoma through the use of latrines. The second session was more like sharing stories, where we would talk about people who actually had experienced trachoma. The third bit was about upgrading, where young people would actually share their stories of how they were able to build latrines in their households. And then the fourth story was one where we invited latrine builders to actually come and share how do you go ahead and build a latrine in your household. So all these different segments, all these different shows had like a specific theme, and listeners could actually call a certain number where we would either record questions and ask them to give feedback on what they thought about the recording itself. One of the highlights that stood out from this campaign was using latrine builders was a big success, because now you were using people from the community who are well known. So they simplified the process of building latrine in those respective communities and made people see that it is something that's achievable. Because during the research, one of the concerns was latrines are expensive, and they were able to actually simplify that. Something else that stood out was we were able to work with the mobilizers on the ground to sort of figure out when would be the best time to air these shows, so that when you have a lot of listeners, and that also ensured that you had your target group of listeners listening to the show itself. One last consideration for this was, because we did this during COVID, it meant that a lot of the communication was done on WhatsApp. So you had teams in the field who could not access, let's say, platforms like Zoom. So you'd have to be in touch with them on WhatsApp, constantly monitoring to know the progress. The script itself was also done in English, translated to Hausa. Then when we went to the field, we realized that Sokoto and Jigawa had different variations of Hausa. So that meant that we had to sort of find people who could alter the script so that it was using the specific dialect of Hausa for that specific, for that community. So those were some of our key considerations. Also, we worked with the local governments in these specific regions, and that meant that we had support from the government itself, and that was also like one of the highlights. I would say those were the two main interventions that we thought we would share in terms of what was the context and how are they successful. I'll pass over to my colleague Samira to take us through the last one for Cote d'Ivoire.
Thank you, Biden. So thank you. Next slide, please. So thank you so much for sharing, Biden. The last set of interventions that I'll share with you happened in Cote d'Ivoire, the Ivory Coast, and actually it involved 3 different interventions that culminated in a final celebration that you're seeing right here. They were focused on community leaders who would be able to kind of perpetuate good hygiene practices within their community, and because they're leaders, they're respected. There's one about vendors where tippy taps were built, like that picture on the left there, in different areas, in public areas, high traffic areas, in the communities. And vendors also were trained on hygiene practices that could actually allow them to have conversations with clients that came and were curious about tippy taps. And finally, mothers who were trained also on hygiene practices were encouraged to have discussions with other women's associations in the group. And at the end, there was a event in the community that these 3 distinct stakeholder groups could attend, as well as other people like the children you see in that GIF on the right. And the goal was really to come together to celebrate the knowledge that was being shared about hygiene practices, tippy taps, latrine building within the community. You had a healthcare worker who was there with a megaphone, really broadcasting all the learnings that were happening. People were very proud, and also certificates were shared to show that people had successfully completed the trainings around behavior, around really important behavior change. And next slide. We have some quotes here from the post-intervention from the community members themselves. One man who participated in building a tippy tap mentioned that he wanted his tippy tap to be respected, the one that he built. And so he named it after an ancestor, really showing that there was value, not only in the tippy tap that he had built, but wanting to share that with other members of the community. That quote in the middle there, is from a participant who participated in the intervention as a vendor and returned to the community after as well. That said, after returning, the tippy taps that were built additionally were still there and were functional. So it wasn't just for show, and that other members in surrounding communities that were not present during the ceremony at the end wanted to build their own tippy taps. And this kind of showed that there was a lot of uptake and interest in what was being done. And finally, we were working, and I'll explain this quickly in our approach. As you've heard, part of it shifted during COVID, but we were working with a research assistant from the Ministry of Health, Dr. Fanta, in Côte d'Ivoire, and she was very interested in our approach of fusing HTD and SBC. And through our process of really building the capacity of our research assistants, was curious on how to learn more, seeing the uptake and the interest in the community, actually seeing people interested in changing their behavior and developing their behavior allowed her to feel very excited about HTD. So next slide. Here is kind of part of, and I won't go too into detail, but as you can see, this was happening before COVID. So these are the 3-4 countries where part of the process actually for the Accelerate program was happening on the ground with Sightsavers and ThinkPlace teams, conducting research, for example, in the targeted design assessment phase and also intervention design phase, on the ground, testing, iterating, learning, and making observations. So this was all done before COVID, so the capacity building could happen in the field. And if you go on the next slide, you see where the pivot happens with COVID-19. This is where at least the intervention I was talking about in the Ivory Coast, for example, really took off. And we as ThinkPlace communities were, as ThinkPlace team was supporting our teams from Dakar, because we were not able to travel in these locations. So a big part of that was building the capacity of people who would continue to do the targeted design assessment, conduct research in the communities, teaching them how to conduct interviews as per a very human-centered design way, as well as supporting them through taking notes, synthesizing that information, making sense of what was coming from the field to help develop those interventions that they ultimately led and tested. And we were touching base with them daily to get insights, to get learnings, and to help support them. So this design by distance program was really unique for the Sightsavers team and for ThinkPlace as well. And we were really able to not only leverage the knowledge on the ground, but build that capacity of human-centered design and social and behavioral change. I'll pass it along to Jordy. Thank you so much for listening.
And Elliot, a lot. You've covered a ton of information, and essentially what has been several year process in a very short time. So we still have 10 minutes. Great. Yeah, and again, just sort of offering up what Samir said. I think one of the the silver linings of the COVID-19 experience too did on top of kind of using this rapid design approach, this design by distance approach, I think really was an interesting approach to doing this by distance. And that example of the healthcare worker who really felt like she learned a lot of skills by doing this, learning the skill. So I wanted to kind of turn over. I know that we've tried to answer some of the questions in the chat. There was one that Elliot didn't quite, well, Elliot mentioned the question about CLTS and the shame piece. There was another question from the folks at the for your research institute. Interesting that you had a specific approach for men in Nigeria. You speak to the rapid approach you use to create messages and outreach to men. So maybe, Samira and Bidan, if you guys were involved in that, want to speak to that a little bit?
Yes, I was actually trying to type it out. Thanks, Jody.
Sure.
So what we realized was, which was really interesting, and this was actually more of a learning across the different countries. A learning across the different countries was young men who had left the city were easy influencers for people who actually were left in the village. So when they went to big towns like Abuja or Lagos and then came back, people actually looked up to them. So their peers would see them as people who had a bit of exposure. Even adults would actually look up to them, and they became easy influencers of what modernity could be. When I was sharing about the radio campaign, they were part of the conversation because we're trying to use people from these communities to actually help amplify this message. And that was one of the ways that we used them. Anyone else can jump in if you have another example of how we used young men.
Thanks, Bidan. I'm just gonna, I know there's lots of questions, we could spend a long time, but I know that we've only got 8 minutes left, so I'll try and answer a few more of the questions that are in the chat. There's a question from Hamed. Nice presentation, Elliot. Such a wonderful impression of Ethiopia with the clean face mirror. Quick question. Was there any consideration to strengthen such hygiene behavior with a sort of self-tracking tool that records usage or progress with hand and face washing incorporated on the mirror itself, thinking this can be useful as the household members use the mirror?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I guess it starts to get to really one of the really tricky bits around measurement and knowing whether it's working. The short answer is no, we didn't put that in, and one of the reasons is if you're going to ask someone to, so if we were to incorporate that, it would have been adding an additional behavior. And the problem with that particular one is the user's not getting a value there. So the intervention works because there was this trigger of, oh, I see my face and I see the photo of me looking beautiful and clean. I'll just give myself a quick wash. But the tracking would only be beneficial to people like us who want to know if they're doing it. So the risk of them, well, it's not even a risk. I could probably take a uneducated guess and say they just wouldn't do it. Yeah.
Thanks, Elliot. There's another comment from Nikhil talking about the token that you had mentioned in response to the LTS question. And Nikhil, happy to share sort of a write-up on that with you or anyone else is interested. I don't know, Elliot, if you wanted to give a quick summary of the Kenya intervention, I think that would be interesting as well.
Yeah, happy to. I mentioned it in that chat comment, but essentially the problem was, if we think about financial barriers, it's not just a binary, do they have money or not? It's actually a prioritization challenge. So there was a target segment that could afford to build a household latrine, but when they look at the card of things they had to spend money on, it just didn't seem that necessary. So there were a few different behavioral triggers we were doing here, but essentially we designed a token that an existing owner of a household latrine could pick 2 to 3 of their neighbors, probably neighbors they preferred or they wanted to impress, and give them to those people to say, hey, look how great I am. I'm going to invite you to use this thing that signals wealth in the community. So they get a nice benefit of pride of look at me, I'm doing something good, great for them. And the families or the individuals that get those tokens then have a trialability channel to use a latrine that's not in the community, avoiding some of the shame barriers that were there. So they can start trialing it, and the theory there being that that builds that confidence or builds that ability to get over it and get the confirmation of value. The additional thing that wasn't designed in but actually proved quite useful was that eventually, you know, the actual owner is sort of saying like, hey, come on now, like time for your own one. So then, you know, after that pride signal has sort of worn down, it then also goes to a little bit of peer pressure, which is always useful.
Yeah, and I can report that, you know, that is still happening. It's an interesting progression to watch as that intervention goes on. It's sort of sped up the building of latrines because of that. the sort of the generousness wearing off, I think you should say. I quickly want to answer. I think I can answer one of the questions from the meeting room. That in objective 3 at the beginning of my slides, that's a whole separate part of the accelerated program that is not related to this presentation at all. It doesn't relate to this topic, but it is a aspect of the bigger accelerated program looking at myosin child. And I see that there's a hand up. Maybe we can take that hand while we've got a couple of minutes. Someone would like to come off and ask a question, but you haven't put it in the chat.
Can I proceed?
Yes, go ahead, please.
Thank you for the nice presentation and also inviting us to such a marvelous discussion. And it's a new approach for us. I am Solomon Tamrat from Amrapels Africa in Ethiopia, and I'm glad to see the intervention which has been done in Afar region, and Elliot presents a very good manner, and I'm very happy to see that. We have been facing a little bit challenge, especially when we start to implement the My Beautiful Family approach, the mirror approach. Initially, the initial document says as Sightsaver conducted research in Afar and Somali, and the peoples are willing to take picture and want to see their pictures hanging on their wall. But as you well know, this pastoralist region are predominantly Muslim community, so they didn't allow to take their picture and post on their wall. So what we have done is to conduct a mini assessment, a kind of a pre-test and a mini rapid assessment. So changing this approach into a mirror concept, the one who Elliot posted on his presentation. So this is a big challenge for us. In Somali region, there is some good and bad approach, because we have been as an SBCC practitioners, we need to conduct a detailed research, because we have implemented or we are using a socio-ecological model approach. So an individual, a community, the government as well, and the environment. So we need to communicate all these stakeholders. So we should bring them and reaching a consensus before implementing any SBCC activity, especially in the rural areas. Therefore, we communicate this people again and come up with this new idea. In addition to this, My Beautiful Family, I really appreciate the ThinkPlace people to design the children materials, gamification. They are very interested while they playing the games and bringing even rehearsing and also making different interactive approaches. It's a well designed material. So I really appreciate again the ThinkPlace as well. So to do this, in some places still we are facing some challenges. For instance, in Afar regions, some of the waradas.
I'm sorry. I'm gonna cut you off. I think it'd be really great to follow up with you directly, but I'm afraid that our time has run to an end.
Okay. One question. Only one question. Sorry.
Sure.
In Afar regions, while we implemented especially the gamification material, the gamification approach in school, we faced some of the schools, almost the majority of the schools that didn't have water. But we are promoting facing your wash in the morning and in the evening, and also while they came up after toilet. So as an HCBCC practitioners, we provide information. But the reason is there is a big gap in the area, especially the water supply. So as a Sightsaver team, what we can do to scale up these HCBCC activities in that area. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Solomon. And I'll try and briefly respond, but again, have to maybe even like pick up. I would be really interested in having a longer conversation with you about that. But I think that the behavior change interventions, I mentioned a number of them, really are kind of in support of that. And then that's sort of the bigger cross collaboration, working with the WASH sector, making sure that these are in support with other government entities, building access to water, making sure that all of the pieces in place. This is one part of a much bigger puzzle. So again, thank you everybody. I know we didn't get to all of the questions, but thanks for a great interactive session. Thank you incredibly much for ThinkPlace's participation, and for Elliot being up at now, I think 1 a.m, talking to us. So I'm going to pass over to LaShawn to sort of close us out, but really huge thanks to everybody that participated. And please feel free to please join iCourse, and also feel free to reach out to me directly or ThinkPlace for further questions. So over to you, LaShawn.
Thank you so much, Jordy. And I'd like to echo Jordy's sentiments. Thank you so much to the Sightsavers team and the ThinkPlace team, and for all of you for joining. And again, if you have an interesting project that you want to share using the iCourse platform, please feel free to reach out to me and iCourse, and we'll get you set up with a session of your own. And we'll actually be having our second Knowledge Exchange Café session on a guide to improving MDA using qualitative methods by Maggie Baker and Elizabeth Fitch on Thursday, July 21st. And I'll send you all a follow-up email with details to register and how to become a member. So with that, thank you all so much for joining, and I look forward to seeing you and interacting in future sessions. Take care.